Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to Animal Climate Heroes with Dr. Allison Pearce Stevens, moderated by our SACA board member, Naomi Boak. I'm Janine Olson, and I'm co-chair of Stanford Alumni for Climate Action, which is bringing you today's webinar. We are a nonpartisan, science-based subgroup of Stanford alumni in sustainability, deeply concerned about the devastating effects of climate change. Our mission is to educate and inspire action, small and large, individual and collective, to meet the climate crisis. Today's webinar will be in conversation format and will close at about 5 p.m. Pacific. You're invited to post your questions as you think of them. Please place your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and be sure to upvote those questions you would especially like to have answered. This event is being recorded and the link to the recording will be emailed to all registrants in a week or two. You are welcome to converse with one another in the chat. And if you find the chat distracting, however, you can click the caret button next to the chat box and unclick the show previews button. You can also enable closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to our guest speaker and our moderator. Alison Pearce Stevens has a master's degree in zoology and a PhD in ecology, evolution, and behavior, both from the University of Minnesota. A former scientist, she now writes award-winning nonfiction books for the world's most curious people to inspire them to protect the world outside their doorstep. She is the author of Junior Library Guild Gold Standard books, Rhino in Nebraska, The Amazing Discovery of the Ashfall Fossil Beds, which won the Nebraska Book Award in 3 categories, and Animal Climate Heroes, which was just published a couple of months ago. She has 3 additional forthcoming books on topics related to conservation and has published hundreds of STEM-based magazine and online articles for kids. Naomi Boak, class of '74, is a founding board member of Stanford Alumni for Climate Action, and she is a Primetime Emmy Award-winning television producer who in 2019 decided to follow her passion for Alaska brown bears and become a park ranger at Katmai National Park. Her work there includes educating people around the globe about bears and the Brooks River ecosystem, as well as producing the annual social media event, Fat Bear Week. So please welcome Naomi and Allison.
Thank you, Janine. I'm
Hi,
excited to be here.
Allison. It's great to have you here. When we were talking about climate change and what to do about it, we have so much doom and gloom, and so I'm very happy to have you here to talk about some good news about some critters that are already doing good things for climate. So welcome.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start by asking you, you're a scientist and a science writer. What brought you to writing for children?
My background's in biology. I was in academia for a while, and then my husband got a job. He's also a scientist. He got a job at one of the Max Planck research institutes in Germany. So we moved overseas, and that was the end of my academic career. We had little kids, and I was reading to them a lot. And it occurred to me that I actually had some pretty interesting things to write about, just based on my experiences and experiences of other people that I'd worked with in graduate school. And that was kind of how I made that leap.
So how different is it writing about science and specifically about climate change for children versus adults?
I think a lot of it's very similar, but there are some definite differences. So, for both of them, you have to make sure that you are meeting your reader where they are and building on the knowledge that they bring to whatever it is you're trying to inform them about. I think that's a lot easier to do with kids than it is with adults because there's just so much range. Maybe an adult hasn't had, if I'm writing about climate, maybe they haven't had any kind of science class since they were in high school and they just don't. So their knowledge that they're bringing into it may not be as strong as somebody who majored in the sciences in college, for example. So there's a lot of disparity there that it's obviously a lot of people write for adults and it's very doable. But for me, writing for kids, I know exactly where my readers are coming in because there are these wonderful standards. You know, I know what they learn in second grade. I know what they learn in third grade. And so if I'm writing for a particular age range, I know the information that they should have coming in at that point, at the lower end of that age group. And then I can start there and build on it. And I also know what they're going to be learning about. So I can be sure to kind of wrap some of those ideas into it as well. So that then when they're learning about things in school, it's all reinforced. All the ideas kind of fit together.
Wish we could do that with adults.
Wouldn't that be nice? Just be like, I know
Yeah.
you have this much knowledge. So there's that piece of it. And the other piece is I feel like I have a lot more freedom and flexibility in terms of, you know, like writing about animals as superheroes. That's probably not an angle I would have taken if I were writing for adults, but it's a very kid-friendly type of approach to use. I feel like I can use some interesting and expressive language that I might not use if I were writing for adults. And so I think there are just some differences there as well.
Do you have a way of getting feedback about your, the children who are reading your books, what their reactions are, or teachers who might use it, and does it spur any action? Are you able to get any feedback like that?
While I'm writing,
Well, no, afterwards.
afterwards. It really depends. So sometimes I always send my work out to beta readers, so I have a pretty good idea, how the work is gonna sit with people with different backgrounds. So I kind of have that piece of it, but I really don't get a lot of direct input from people, other than what they post as reviews online, which, by the way, reviewing books is really helpful. So if you have a book you like, review it. Doesn't have to be mine, any book.
That's good advice. So how did you come up with the idea of animal climate heroes?
It was during the pandemic shutdown when everybody was stuck at home. So I was watching a lot of webinars, and there was an editor at Scholastic who just happened to mention that her favorite fact was that sea otters help fight climate change. And even though I knew, as a biologist, I knew that interaction, I knew the system, having her state it that way, I immediately got this picture of a sea otter in boxing gloves going up against this personification of climate change, which was actually how I started writing the book, was with this sort of boxing ring angle, until I realized that then it's basically the same thing for every animal. But as I was researching it, I realized, they really all have sort of superpowers that they're bringing to the table. So it changed to that instead.
Well, and I think superpowers are perfect to get kids excited about that. So you've got 4 animals that you feature in this book. You've got great whales and forest elephants, and you mentioned sea otters. I love sea otters. And echidnas. Is that how you pronounce it? Echidnas. So do you have a favorite?
Oh, that's hard.
You don't have to have a favorite, but just
I don't know. I really like echidnas just because they're so different from all of the others.
So talk about echidnas. What is it that they do as climate heroes?
So for anyone who's not familiar with echidnas, they live in Australia and New Guinea. They're not very big. They're about the size of a house cat. And their closest relative is actually the platypus. So they, just like the platypus, they seem like they're sort of this mishmash of other animals put together. So sometimes people call them spiny anteaters. They look kind of like a hedgehog. They have a long snout and a sticky tongue like an anteater does. Like platypus, they lay eggs. Those are the only 2 mammals that lay eggs. They have a pouch like a kangaroo, and they have these big claws on all 4 of their feet that they use to break through the hard soil in Australia, since it's pretty dry there. They get this really hard crust on the soil, so they use those claws to dig through that in order to find ants and termites to eat. And that is their superpower, actually, is their digging. And so one of these little echidnas moves 8 tons of soil every year. They just dig constantly. And so by breaking through that crust, they open up places where when rain does fall, it can get down into the ground so that the trees can get to it. And the pits also collect all of the leaf litter and fruits and seeds and things. And so that breaks down into compost that helps feed those trees. And so they really keep the forests going and keep them healthy. So that's really what they're doing there.
So how did you find out about echidnas?
So when I started researching the book, so there was the sea otter idea and I'd heard about the role of great whales. And so I thought, well, I need more animals than that. And I just started searching wide. Like I said, it was the shutdown. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do. So I spent a lot of time sitting right here in my office on my computer, just looking for animals where there was some research that demonstrated that they were having some kind of impact on their ecosystem that drew carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So that's what all of these animals have in common, is that they are obviously not removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere themselves, but they impact the photosynthesizers, the plants and the algae, and boost their health so that they can pull carbon dioxide out when they're photosynthesizing. And it was there was a researcher in Australia who had written a piece for the conversation about the role of echidnas as climate heroes. And I thought, well, this is perfect.
So in terms of echidnas as a species, are they safe? Are they abundant, or do we have to worry about them?
The short-beaked echidna, so there are multiple species, I think 2, maybe 3. The short-beaked echidnas, which are the ones that I wrote about, they are actually doing fine. They're doing really well. I think that, it's hard for things to eat them because when they're threatened, they, as you might expect, they don't exactly roll into a ball, but they actually dig a little pit really quickly and curl up inside of it so that there's just a bunch of spikes sticking out of the ground. So they're pretty well protected from predators. So they're doing okay. I think the long-beaked echidnas might be struggling, but I'm not quite as sure since I wasn't writing about them.
I'll let that go. So I wanted to talk about the great whales. I was out halibut fishing with a fisherman in Alaska a few years ago, and he before he was doing commercial fishing, he was out protecting whales, and he was spotting Norwegian and Japanese whalers and preventing them from whaling. And he would tell me that if we lose whales, that's the end of life on Earth. It was a really kind of dire statement. But so and when you write about the great whales, I mean, I can see the complex connection between so many creatures and so many things in a very vast ecosystem. Can you talk about what the great whales do?
Yeah, so they have what they call the whale pump. And so these whales go down to feed and then they come up to the surface, and when they get to the surface, that's where they poop. And that poop is the key to the marine ecosystem. It really is. So it's bringing up all the nutrients all the phytoplankton are up at the surface because that's where the light is. But the whales are feeding down deep where it's way too dark for any kind of photosynthesis. But everything in the ocean just kind of sinks, slowly settles down to the bottom. So by doing this, by feeding down low and then bringing those nutrients up to the surface, they trigger this explosion in growth of phytoplankton. The phytoplankton are fed on by zooplankton. The zooplankton are eaten by fish. And so that is the base of the marine ecosystem right there. And so if you take the whales away, you lose that pump and all the nutrients sink down and they're just lost. And actually for a while, people thought, early on, people were hunting whales for blubber and for meat. And then they actually transitioned to hunting them because they thought they were competition for fish because there weren't as many fish. But it turns out that if you don't have enough whales, you don't have any fish. So there's kind of this, it's been a process getting people to kind of come about in terms of understanding just how essential they are for ocean life.
Of course, I live in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was, the center of whaling. So that's an important history. And there's always some kind of delicate balance between what humans do to survive in certain environments and what the living ecosystems and creatures around us do. And of course, we're very wrong-headed about whales. And luckily, most people are not anymore. But what are the threats to whales?
So the biggest threats right now are ship strikes. If the whales are anywhere near shipping channels, then being struck by a ship can be lethal. They can get tangled in fishing gear. So I know for the North American right whale, which is the most endangered whale out there, these are the two things. If it's an adult, that's what's killing them. The other problem that they're seeing is actually climate change, because climate change is shifting where their food is located, and so so for the right whales, for example, they had protections in areas where people knew they usually showed up, but they started following their food into new areas where the protections hadn't been enacted. And there were, I think, 12 or 14 whales killed just in 1 year because of that. And it was mostly fishing gear entanglement for that one. So it's all three of those.
Yeah. So have we seen changes in ecosystems where there have been fewer whales? Like, for instance, they're because of climate change, their feeding grounds have changed. So do we know anything about the ecosystems where they used to be?
I don't know that we do. I'm not 100%. Maybe there's work that's been done on that, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay. A question for one of the readers of your book to find out, right?
Yes.
So the fishermen in Alaska wasn't that far off. We really
Yeah,
need whales for
we
their
really do. Yeah.
fish. It also reminds me of how ecosystems are so intertwined.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the easiest and best examples of that is the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone, right?
Mhm.
Everything then became in balance again.
Mhm.
And one thing that we need to do in these ecosystems is to have balance. And so it's important that humans figure out their relationship to all these climate heroes.
We've lived for a long time as though humans are somehow separate from nature, but we're part of nature. And I think we just have to figure out exactly how we fit into the picture.
Yeah, which brings me to the forest elephants,
Mhm.
because all different kinds of elephants all over the world frequently come in conflict
Mhm.
with humans, whether it's in India, where, elephants are all around agriculture.
Mhm.
Um, Tell us about the forest elephants and how they're climate heroes.
So forest elephants, a little bit smaller than their savanna cousins that we're used to seeing. These are African forest elephants. So they're in West Africa in the tropical rainforest there. Um, and it's actually kind of counterintuitive, but they help the forest store carbon by being really big and destructive. So the way elephants feed, if you think about it, they eat leaves and branches and bark. And so they just take their trunk and they just tear off the leaves, or they rip down a branch, or they just uproot an entire small tree to munch on. They trample small trees into the ground. But that action actually benefits the surrounding trees because it's basically like gardening, right? You go into your garden and you pull weeds so that they're not competing for water and nutrients and sunlight with the plants you want growing. Well, all the trees that aren't damaged by the elephants are getting more nutrients, more water. They're able to grow tall enough to get more sunlight. And so if you think about it, there are two different kinds of trees within the forest, and this is probably going to be pretty familiar to most people. You've got the ones that produce lots and lots of seeds, and so they come up everywhere. We would consider them kind of weedy because of that. And then you have the ones that are kind of slow growing, and those are the ones that take a lot longer to get tall. And elephants really like eating the leaves of those fast growing kind of weedy species because the plants don't take the time to make chemicals to prevent herbivory. The slow growing species are partly slow growing because they're actually making all of these tannins, these bitter tasting things, so that nothing will eat them. And so the elephants are eating all of the fast growing weedy species and trampling them into the ground. allowing those slower growing trees to do well. And those slower growing trees actually, so if you have an oak tree, for example, versus something, you know, a birch tree or something that's much faster, the density of the wood is very different. So you have really hard wood because it's actually putting more carbon into the wood. And so it literally stores more per cubic centimeter than a fast growing species. So that's really helpful there. But the elephants also, they prefer to eat the fruit from the slow growing species. I think because they're bigger, you know, it's just more energy for the amount of time you spend chewing. And they don't spit out the seeds, so they just swallow them whole. And a few days later, they come out in a nice pad of fertilizer. So they're also fertilizing the forest. They're planting seeds around the forest of all of these hardwood species. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but people consider them the gardeners of the forest. And a tropical rainforest with and without elephants they look completely different. And the one with elephants has fewer trees, but stores much more carbon.
Oh, it's so interesting. And I bet the kids are very enthusiastic about all the poop stories.
Oh yes, they love those.
Poo-nados.
Yep,
And we have forest elephants that spread seeds through their poop.
they do. And they poop like 17 times a day or something like that. So there's a
Oh
lot.
my goodness. So I'm sure that's a big hit with sixth
Oh
graders.
yeah.
Another animal that you talk about as a climate hero are sea otters. I love sea otters, of
Me
course.
too.
Being in Alaska, you know, love to kayak among rafts of sea otters, and they're really wonderful. But I didn't realize that they are climate heroes. How are they climate heroes?
So I think it's primarily along the California coast and areas along the Western United States where you have the sea otters are closely tied to kelp forests, and some of them also like to eat urchins. So the kelp forests are really, really important ecosystems for a variety of reasons. From a climate perspective, kelp grows really fast. In fact, during the spring when it's growing, it can grow 2 feet a day. So you can literally watch it growing right in front of your eyes. So that whole time it's just sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So it's really important there. And what can happen, well, another reason it's important is it's a nursery for a lot of fish, including commercially important fish. It's an entire ecosystem just right there offshore. And then the kelp, because it grows all the way up to the surface, it's really important in terms of slowing wave action. So when you have storms coming in, we were talking about tsunamis before we started, it helps to slow the movement of that water. So it helps protect the shoreline from erosion. So these are really important ecosystems. And one of the big threats to kelp right now are purple sea urchins. And so the urchins are normally, they're a really important part of the ecosystem. They are kind of the cleanup crew. So normally you're going to have, bits of algae that falls down and they'll scurry around on the ground and they'll eat them. And they actually, if there are predators around, they spend most of their time kind of hiding in crevices. But when you don't have enough predators, then they don't spend a lot of time hiding and they get a lot of food to eat, and then they reproduce, and pretty soon you have a lot of them. In fact, they call it a horde of sea urchins when you have just a huge number of them. And when you have that many, then they're not just eating the scraps on the floor, they are actually climbing up the kelp, and they're, not even just going for the blades, the leaf-like blades, but they actually start just chewing through the stalk and breaking the kelp free, and the entire kelp is then loose and no longer attached. And it only takes, I think, a couple of months for a horde of sea urchins to decimate an entire kelp forest.
Wow.
So what the sea otters do, and also sunflower stars, so there are 2 big predators on the urchins, what they do is they keep those numbers in check. So that's their role and how they can be helpful there.
Are these the same kind of sea urchins that we find in, say, Maine or, other places where they're harvested for eating for us?
I am not sure. I'm not sure what kinds of urchins are there. I mean, there are a lot of different urchins actually. And it seems to be the purple sea urchins that are problematic.
I know where I am in Massachusetts and around Buzzards Bay, kelp is really important, but we're the ones killing it off. It's nitrogen that's killing it off. So we're trying to get rid of some of the nitrogen in the water so that we're saving the kelp. So how are sea otters doing? Are they threatened at all by us or other things in climate change?
Yeah, they're not doing great. They're partly, certainly along the coast of California where if they don't have the kelp, that's where they hang out. That's their nursery too. That's where they leave their babies when the parents are diving. And it's a place where they're protected from predators for the most part. So certainly those populations have been struggling. They're not doing so hot.
Is there anything we can do or anything that is being done
Well, I'm
to?
pretty sure when you pay your taxes in the state of California, there's a sea otter fund that you can donate to.
All right, all
And
these Stanford alumni need to remember
right.
that. Okay.
And the other thing that's really big actually is to reduce, like you were saying with the nitrogen, is to reduce the amount of pollution that we're putting into the ocean, because when pollution gets into the ocean, it has all kinds of effects. So if it's nitrogen, for example, you can end up with with harmful algal blooms, and then you end up with toxins in the water, and that can make the sea otter sick, and maybe it won't kill them, but they might be more susceptible to other things. And so there are a lot of things. If we can keep things out of the water, then we can keep the whole ecosystem a lot healthier.
Are there any kind of organizations specifically that are targeting these kinds of ecosystems where these animal climate heroes are, to protect them, or are the animal heroes kind of doing it on their own mostly? I know you say the sea otters are not doing too well, but
There are the World Wildlife Fund is actually doing a lot to try, and you can even go in and you can adopt one of these animals, so that your money is going to help protect the animals and the ecosystem that they live in. Because I think most people realize now that you can't protect the animal without protecting the place where it lives. So that's really where their efforts are.
yeah. And I know from my work that getting to know, because my work is with brown bears, and we've done research that shows if you can recognize an individual,
Mhm.
right, that you are much more likely to contribute to any conservation cause. So are there ways that, I mean, hopefully the children can get some access, maybe in aquariums or other places, to connect with individuals? What can be done to inspire us and inspire children to do things? Obviously, you've written a book to do that, but what else on the ground can we do?
I think getting kids outside and like exposure to nature. I think, I don't see kids playing outside in my neighborhood like I used to. I think it's become less and less common for children to be exposed to nature for whatever reason. And they're fascinated by it. Like they're perfectly happy to just sit outside and watch the insects crawling out around on the ground, right? It's just built-in entertainment right there. And so I think if we can reconnect them to the world outside the doorstep, and it doesn't have to be a big trip. You don't have to go to Yellowstone. You don't have to go on a whale watching tour, but just connecting with what you have in your yard, learning to recognize individual birds that come to visit, or, squirrels that stop by, whatever it might be. I think that's a really important place to start.
I've lived most of my life in New York City, and parks and nature, they're very important, even though you don't think of that in New York City. You think of concrete and sidewalks and honking horns, but there are little parks everywhere, almost everywhere. In poor neighborhoods, not so much, which is another problem for us. That connection to for city kids is really important. And do you see any programs in schools that are helping some of these animal climate heroes, or connecting kids to nature?
Nothing that directly links into the animal climate heroes. And I think in terms of connecting to nature, there are a number of schools that have sort of green teams and they're implementing outdoor learning spaces. When my kids were in elementary school, I helped install an outdoor classroom. And a lot of the teachers were kind of nervous about taking the kids outside to use it until they took them outside and discovered that, oh, they're actually really calm out here and they're paying attention. It was the opposite of what they had anticipated. So I think as you have more of those kinds of efforts, I think that's where you're going to start seeing those kinds of connections.
So you've highlighted these animal climate heroes. Do you have suggestions for how we can become climate heroes?
I do. There's a whole chapter on that in the book.
I know that.
Yeah, there are so many things we can do. And I think that one of the really important things, because climate change is a huge, huge weight that is just over us. And it's really important to realize that single one of us can have an impact, and we don't have to, completely change the way we live our lives overnight in order to do better. It's really a series of really small steps. So, since we're talking to adults and not kids, I would say, don't idle your car. And I know a lot of people, used to be a long time ago that you actually used more gas to start the car than you did to let it idle, but that is not the case anymore. And so there's the link is actually in the book, but there's this great YouTube video where they actually tested it out and he shows how it works. And it turns out that for a small 4-cylinder engine car, 7 seconds. 7 seconds of idling uses the same amount of gas that it takes to start the engine. So if you're sitting in a carpool line or you're sitting in the drive-through and you're just idling your engine, you're literally just burning gas for nothing, unless you need it for climate control. And so that's a really big one right now. If you can just get in the habit of turning off the engine when you don't need to have it running. Another big one is lawns. We were talking about all the things that are washing off into the oceans, and lawns are a huge part of that. Agriculture obviously is too, but on a per area basis, chemicals, so in terms of both fertilizers and pesticides, which includes herbicides, they are used at something like 8 to 10 times more per unit area in urban areas than they are on agricultural fields. So they're way overused, and anything that doesn't get used by those plants or doesn't do what it's supposed to do there, it washes off and it goes downstream and it ends up in the ocean. That's why we have a big dead zone at the end of the Mississippi River in the Gulf of Mexico, is all of the agricultural and urban runoff that's going down the way. So those are two really big things.
And I would imagine that if you substituted more native plants and other things for grass, it's also helping the ecosystem in general. Yes. For creatures, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's really important to choose native plants because, we hear a lot about pollinator gardenings and providing for pollinators, but people tend to only think about adult pollinators, which are feeding on the flowers. But pollinators go through a larval stage. And especially if you think about butterflies, you have caterpillars. Well, caterpillars don't eat flowers, they eat leaves, which means you have to provide plants that they can eat. And they're going to have holes and they're not going to look pretty for a while. And then the caterpillars pupate and the plants recover actually really well. It can be really hard to watch it happen the first season when you just don't know what to expect. So it's really important when you're choosing those plants that you're not just having a variety of flowers so you have different species going all season long, but also that you have those host plants for the larvae that they really need to have so that you can actually have more butterflies down the line.
Yeah, no, I think it's wonderful. I have a neighbor who has the side of his house and it's all native plants, and I love walking by there every day because I see different creatures in there, different kinds of bees and moths and it's just there's this whole small ecosystem right around the corner from me. And the other thing is ecosystems are so intertwined, and I think when we forget that about that with the way we live, either
Mhm.
in the suburbs or in cities. We just we're not integrated into an ecosystem. I'm very lucky. Usually spend half of my year in this amazing small ecosystem in
Mhm.
Alaska, which has its creature hero, which is salmon,
Mhm.
and that gets distributed through the bear poop
Mhm.
and other things, and the birds, and it's, the salmon really are the keystone of that ecosystem. So that's been a real education for me. And so I gravitate to my neighbors um lovely side area, which is not a lawn, but is full of native plants. So what else can we do? I know there are tons of things that we can do to emulate the heroism of these four animals that you talk about.
Oh, there are lots of things. I have a Substack that's not geared for kids. It's for adults. It's every 2 weeks. That is every 2 weeks you get a suggestion. You can, don't turn off your outside lights at night. So you're reducing your electricity use. Obviously, you're turning off hopefully lights inside the house. But the outside lights are interfering with all that nature we were just talking about. They think it might be one of the reasons why firefly populations are declining. So if you live in an area with fireflies, that's a good incentive right there. Um, Turning off fans when you leave the room. So it turns out fans don't actually change the temperature of a room. They just make you feel cooler. It's kind of that wind chill effect.
Mhm.
So there's no reason to leave a fan on if nobody's in the room because it's not doing anything unless you're there to actually feel that breeze on you. So there are just lots of little ways that you can reduce your energy usage. Um, if you have small appliances like an air fryer, using that instead of using your oven is far more efficient. So yeah.
I think the other thing is, if we can get our children and grandchildren to read your book, that it might inspire them to kick us in the butt to do things, right?
That would be
Because
great. Yeah.
children and young people really are the ones who are inspired to do things
Yeah,
about climate change, because they're the ones who are going to have to live with it much
yes.
longer than we do. So hopefully they get inspired. And I have seen children get inspired and do things. And so I'm very happy that your book will help do that. We have a couple of questions.
Okay.
And if anyone has more questions for Allison, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll look at them. So Robbie asks, I like this, what would be a good climate pet to have instead of dogs or cats?
Oh my goodness. A good climate pet. No one has asked me that question, Robbie. I have to think on that one. I don't know. You've stumped me. I don't know. I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, it's a great question.
It's a great question. Yeah.
I mean, I know, cats who are outdoors are problematic
Yeah.
because they're hunters.
Right.
Um, Hopefully maybe dogs spread something through their poop, but we pick that up.
We
So
do pick that
hopefully,
up, usually in plastic bags, so it's not helping
I
any.
know, which is another problem.
Yep.
But yeah, that's you have to get back to us. Think about
I
that.
will. Okay, hang on. I'm gonna write that down so I remember it.
I love that question. Jill Baxter is a teacher. She's a teacher educator and wanted to send a copy of your book to every elementary teacher I've worked with over the years. Have you thought of writing a guide for teachers that would help them design activities to help children connect with the important ideas in your book?
I have actually, and I'm really glad to hear you say that because I need to follow up with the person who was going to design that guide for me. So thank you, Jill. Yes. And once it's available, I will, and I don't know how long that'll take, but I will have it available on my website. It'll be freely available.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we had talked earlier, one of the things that I'm going to be working on this summer is to work out a curriculum to inspire the kids who are like Fat Bear Week, which is
Nice.
something that I do. Bill Gorham asks, what is the general age group that your books are geared for? I'm hoping to educate my 6-year-old grandson to teach his dad to work to a better world for him, his dad, and the rest of the world.
I love that. So it's technically for 8 and up, but you can always, if you can sit down and do read alouds with it. I got a review from someone who was reading it to her 5-year-old, and her 5-year-old loved it. In fact, she said it was the first time that her child had ever asked the next morning to keep reading what they'd been reading before they went to bed the night before. So you can always do it as a read aloud and then have the book available for your grandson when he's able to read it on his own.
Yeah. And then, to extend what you've got, to find places where they can find out more about these climate heroes, right? Which is always good because, I remember when I was that age, I loved finding out about individual animals. And so hopefully they can do that. So Ravi has another question. Okay. How would I make my yard climate friendly here in the San Francisco Bay Area? It's currently drought friendly only. Is that enough?
Well, drought friendly is certainly an important start. It depends on the types of plants that you have in there. So if they are, what you really want to incorporate, if you haven't already, are plants that are native to the general area. Because those are the plants, any insect, any wildlife that you have, and that includes the insects, which are kind of the base of the food chain. They need the plants that they have evolved with, right? They have certain plants that they do really well with, certain plants that they need. And so the more of those kinds of plants that you can provide for them, the better the habitat quality will be, and the better the insects will thrive. There's an organization called the Xerces Society, which is all about protecting invertebrates. And they call, the insects are the little things that run the world. And without insects, we're in a lot of trouble. We think of them as pests, but most of them are not. So really making sure that you are accommodating their needs. That's really the important thing. And if you're doing a lot of native plants, then they're probably going to be drought friendly as well, I would imagine.
Yeah. And where can people learn about plants native to their area? How can you find out?
There are more and more resources online, so it's pretty easy to do a search. There is a resource I used a lot when I first started transitioning our yard to native plants was the Ladybird Wildflower Center, which is in Texas. But they have this amazing website where you can go in and you can say that you're looking for plants that are native to a particular state, that bloom at a particular time, that are a certain color when they bloom or reach a certain height. You can restrict anything you want, which can make it really hard, but you can also just go in and say, what grows here, right? What's native to where I live? And kind of start with that and start figuring out what kinds of things you like, what things might be easy or difficult to get. That's the other thing, getting native plants is a lot easier than it used to be even 5 years ago. But sometimes you have to work with specialty nurseries in order to find that.
Yeah. And there's a whole school for kids in just exploring the native plants and what critters they end up seeing once you've got the native plants there that they weren't seeing before, and that appreciation of and just being more observant. I'm living in a small city, and I'm always looking up for birds, right? And they like different kinds of plants and insects, and it all works together. So it's a great it's a great way for adults and kids to learn. Try and revamp. Let's get rid of lawns.
And then you can do things like you can use, the app on your phone where you identifies birdsong. So then, you can. I was just talking to someone today. She leaves her app just sitting outside and just recording, and comes back later to see what did it find. So it's a really interesting way to kind of see what's stopping through. And I know since we increased the native plants in our yard and really we got rid of a lot of lawn, we have birds stopping through that I'd never seen before, which has been really fun. And they're just, passing through when they're migrating. But that was a really neat thing for me. They've never stopped through before that I'd noticed.
Yeah. There was a odd plant a couple of blocks from me, and I managed to find the persons who lived there. And they told me that the Missouri Botanical Garden has a great app where you can take pictures of different plants and find out what they are. So again, it's another connection to nature, right? If we can get curious about what's around us and help our kids grow their curiosity, then we're more committed to the planet, I think, and more committed to taking action.
Yeah,
So,
I think so too.
anything else you want to tell this group, advice for so that we can be climate heroes?
Well, I will. You mentioned this the other day, Naomi, so I'm going to circle back to it since we haven't talked about it today. But, you know, I mentioned with whales that climate change is actually strongly impacting them. And, you know, and I'll come back to that in a second. When you come across stories, you know, on social media or in the news, and you're not sure who's behind something, it's worth questioning and trying to find out, because there's been a big push on the East Coast, you will know this, Naomi, to stop the development of offshore wind. Well, offshore wind is going to be a really important piece of this stopping climate change puzzle. And so the tactics that groups are using, and they seem to be grassroots organizations, is save the whales because they're harming, or is to save the whales. They say that the offshore wind turbines are hurting the whales. But it turns out there's no evidence to that. I already talked about the main reasons that whales are being injured. Those groups don't ever talk about those things that are harming the whales. They only talk about the offshore wind farms. And there's a really great report that came out in December from the, what are they called? I wrote it down just to be sure I could remember the name. The Climate and Development Lab, which is at Brown University. And I apologize if there's background noise. My family's in the kitchen right now doing the dishes.
You're fine.
So
You're
they
lucky
put
your
together.
family are doing the dishes while you're here.
They're doing the dishes. That's right. I am not doing the dishes. So they traced the funding for all of these grassroots organizations, and it almost all comes from people who have fossil fuel interests. Over $60 million since 2017.
I'm shocked.
And the idea
shocked,
behind it. What?
I'm shocked.
So, you know, but they come across as this, I'm just a concerned citizen trying to protect the whales, but there's very much an agenda behind it. So I think it's just really useful. And it's so hard now because everything has spin and everything, you know, is so extreme in so many ways. But I think it's really useful to sometimes just take a step back and think, okay, who benefits from this particular piece of information before just accepting something as true? And that way you can just be a more informed person as you're just trying to navigate the incredible flood of information that's coming at us all the time.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. So how do we find your Substack, and how do people find your book?
My book, I should have pulled up links ahead of time. I can't. How about this? Why don't I send those links to you or Janine, and then when the recording goes out to everybody, we can just include them in that email. Does that work?
That works.
Okay.
Great.
I can't, what I will do is throw in the chat my website. So I can't send it to everyone. Because you can always order, there are order links there if you're interested in it. And once you have a curriculum guide, that's where it will be.
Yay. Allison, thank you so much. It was, I'm inspired. And I hope the people who joined us were also inspired. I think that, you know, there are things we can do. We have a tough job ahead of us.
Yes.
And lots of money fighting us. But I think our hope is in inspiring children and the next generations to fight the good fight. So thank you for your wonderful book.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and thank goodness for all the poopers out there that are helping.
Poop is way more important than anybody realized.
Way more important. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Naomi.
Oh, it was a pleasure. All right.
Good night.
Bye-bye.